Hello, this is Vincent at Chivalrous Game presenting the Chivalrous Games Common library. The Common library is a set of tools that you can use in any of your project and is supplied with any Chivalrous game asset. In this video we're going to look at a new feature that is provided in the Chivalrous Games Common library, and it's the generic dynamic NavMesh. It's designed to work with any part of your projects, and it will create a dynamic NavMesh for you. It's heavily based on the dynamic NavMesh solution that was provided by Unity, and I embedded it in the Chivalrous Game Common library so it's easier to get if you use any Chivalrous game asset into your project. So let's get to it. This is the example scene that is provided with the Chivalrous Games library, and I already have a copy of each and every possible element that you can add into a dynamic NavMesh. So it all starts with the dynamic NavMesh builder. This is this little guy here. It's the NavMesh Delimited builder script. You simply put this on an empty game object, and then you set the size of your delimited NavMesh builder through the scale values of the transform. And this is basically the area that the game will use to generate your NavMesh. If you want a bigger NavMesh, then you enter big values. It's really simple. And you can move it around, and this will be the area where your dynamic NavMesh is created. Now, what the dynamic NavMesh builder does is collect elements in your scene that have NavMesh dynamic tag scripts. So, for example, I have a terrain in my scene, and it has a NavMesh dynamic terrain tag script. So it's very simple. You create your terrain, and then let's say I just remove this. I'm gonna type in dynamic NavMesh and click on NavMesh dynamic terrain. And then you select which NavMesh area this should be a part of. And I'm not going to explain what the NavMesh area is because it's standard Unity NavMesh knowledge. If you need some help on how the NavMesh area will configure your NavMesh, then you can simply look at the Unity documentation. So that's it for the NavMesh dynamic terrain. Now, if you want to use some models with colliders in your scene, I have set up this little element here, so you can see it's basically just a primitive of a cube, and I added a box collider on it. And I would like this box collider to be a part of my NavMesh, so I simply add the NavMesh dynamic collider on it. Okay, I have a cylinder here, and as you can see, the cylinder is round. But in my example, I'm not interested in having a round area added to my NavMesh, so I kind of delimited the area around the cylinder with a NavMesh dynamic primitive. This is all the primitives that are available in the Unity NavMesh system, so I'm not going to explain it. You can easily find information about the various primitives you can have to a NavMesh in the Unity website. So I could select a box or a capsule or a sphere, but in my example I want to carve out a box area in the NavMesh. So you simply add this script to your element. It could very well be an empty game object, and then determine the size and the area. So the way this is set up right now, everything contained in this little box primitive is not going to be a walkable area on the NavMesh. If I look at another component, I have a sphere over here, and this sphere is a primitive also. It has a mesh filter and a sphere collider, but for the purpose of this test I'm not going to use a NavMesh dynamic collider. I'm simply using a NavMesh dynamic mesh. So this tagging component uses a mesh filter rather than a collider. And I decided that this area wouldn't be walkable either, so I selected not walkable. Now let's take a look at the ModifierBox tagging element. The ModifierBox basically is a delimited zone into your NavMesh where the contained elements should be a part of a different NavMesh area. So my terrain is a walkable area, as you can see, and the top of my box here is a walkable area too. But if I want to create another behavior, I can create a modifier box over here and say that anything contained within this box should be a not walkable area. So it's very simple. You simply add the NavMesh dynamic modifier box to your component. This is an empty game object. You set the size of this box and you set the NavMesh area. If I go a little further, I also have a NavMesh link over here, because when my NavMesh gets created, the top of this box and the terrain won't be linked together. There's a big gap between those two surfaces. So if I want one of my NavMesh agent to be able to move from the terrain to the box and vice versa, I have to link these two elements together. So I created a NavMesh dynamic link, and it's simply a script that you add at an empty game object, and then you configure the start and end position of your link. You can either type in values or move them around with the little labels over here. You can use the swap, align, transform, and refresh buttons. There are basically shortcut buttons to help you set this up quickly, and then you can fine-tune the values with the fields. You also determine the width of your link, and this is basically where your NavMesh agent can enter the link. It will be able to enter anywhere in the width area, but it will always exit at the precise end position. Here you have a cost modifier, so if you raise this cost modifier when the NavMesh agent tries to find a path to move between different areas of your NavMesh, it will consider that the jump is harder to use than moving around. If you have a high cost modifier, and if you have 0, then it considers that the jump is just as easy to use than any other area of the NavMesh. This can give interesting results, and the bidirectional configuration tells your NavMesh agent if he can use the NavMesh link from both directions. In this case, I want my NavMesh agent to be able to jump down from the box and to jump onto it, so bidirectional is what I want. But if I wanted my NavMesh agent to only be able to jump down from the box, then my start point would be here, my end point would be here, and my link wouldn't be bidirectional. And just like any other tagging component, you have to determine for which area type this link should be a part of. For the purpose of this example, I added a dynamic agent, and this is a script that's a little shortcut to help you create your Unity NavMesh agent. Here I have an NPC agent script, and all this script does basically is tells the agent to move from one waypoint to another on the NavMesh, and the little spheres around the NavMesh are the waypoints the agent tries to reach. This script, when the game starts, is going to call the NavMesh dynamic agent and asks it to create a Unity NavMesh agent on the capsule. And when it does, the NavMesh dynamic agent is going to try to reach the NavMesh itself. Since this is a dynamic NavMesh, we don't really know when it's going to be ready to use. So the NavMesh dynamic agent script basically waits for the NavMesh to appear, and when it does, it will create the Unity NavMesh agent on my capsule over here. And when the NavMesh agent is created, it's going to call back my NPC agent script to configure my agent the way I want. So that's basically it. If I press play and start the game, you will see a blue overlay appear. Here we go. And this is my dynamic NavMesh. And you can see that the NavMesh is contained into the dynamic NavMesh builder. It's a delimited area. And as you can see, my NavMesh agent is moving around trying to reach its little waypoints. And for example, if I decide to, I don't know, move my modifier box around here, then the not walkable area is going to change. And my agent is going to try to avoid this area when it tries to reach its waypoint. So if I put it here, you're going to see it's going to move around it. And there he goes. That's basically it. You have a dynamic NavMesh for your project. The Chivalrous Games Common library is included in all Chivalrous Games asset and is packed with a ton of tools to help you create your game. You can get it now on the Unity Asset Store. Thank you.